opportunity to betray him. This is the word of the Lord.
Hi, you can go ahead and have a seat. My name is, sorry, I'm going to bump into this, I just know it. My name is Ricky, serves one of the pastors here. Kids, so glad to have you guys with us. Yeah, I'm glad that you guys get to worship, dig into the Word. So, if your parent is, looking at Facebook or whatever, you give them a nudge and be like, hey, you're supposed to model this to me, what worship is. So, but yeah, really glad to have you guys here. Perspective, how we see things, how we see a situation, something, the world, that basically determines how you're going to act, determines your life, how you're going to respond to the world around you, how you're going to respond to something. If you think something is bigger or more important or smaller, you're going to respond in bigger or smaller ways. So let's say that I've made some cookies, they're chocolate chip cookies, and someone has now taken some of those cookies. I'm upset. It's like, hey, those are really, man, those were mine. What are you doing? Who took those? But if they're raisin cookies, it's like, man, joke's on you. Those are gross. Sick. And if you're like, oh, well, wait a minute, I like raisin cookies, that's your perspective. It's wrong, but it's your perspective. Right? If you're driving and you see like a dead dog on the side of the road, you're like, man, heartbroken. My gosh, what happened? You see a dead cat, man, no big deal. Right? Keep driving. I like cats, getting your perspective. Right? We all need to have the right perspective. I was on a trip with my oldest son. He's in 8th grade, and we're in Washington, D.C., and we're going to these very, awesome places, but they're heavy. So we're going to the Holocaust Museum. We're going to Arlington Cemetery, where there's just hundreds of thousands of people that have served and died or career served in the military. We watch the changing of the guard, and we're going to these different places, and each time the teacher is getting up there telling us, reminding all of the students, this is where we're going, right? This is what's happened. And what he's trying to do is to just remind us, hey, have some perspective. These are very serious places, so this is not a time to be goofing around, horsing around, talking, being loud. Helping us to have the right perspective so that we respond accordingly. The weird thing about perspective is you don't know if you lack perspective. Right? If you're 5 years old, 6 years old, 5 minutes feels like a long time. When you're an adult, you're like 5 minutes is nothing. 5 months feels like nothing even. Right? If you're one of those parents at a Little League game and you're screaming at the ref, getting super angry, right? And then the other parents are maybe thinking, whoa, have some perspective. Nobody cares about this game in 5 hours, right? As we even have those sayings, have some perspective, or we need to get some perspective, because however we view the world, different things around us determines really how we act, what we do, what we think. And so I'd say the most important perspective, how you view something, for you and me today is, what is your perspective of God? Who do you really think that He is? Are you and I maybe in danger of actually lacking perspective and we don't even know it? And then as we look at this story today, we're just going to be looking at okay, man, do we need to adjust our perspective in some ways? Are we in need of getting some perspective? Or kind of specifically think of it this way, as it ties to this perspective of what we have of Jesus is, what is Jesus worth to you? How do you measure the worth of Jesus in your heart and your life? Because however you measure the worth of Jesus will determine the measure of your worship to Him. Let me just say that again. However you measure the worth of Jesus will determine the measure in which you worship Him. So if you got a Bible, open up to Matthew 26. Matthew 26, it is the first book of the New Testament. Parents, help your kids there if they need help. Matthew 26. Start there in verse 1. So when Jesus had finished saying all of these things, okay, and so basically this is a phrase in Matthew that he uses multiple times when after Jesus has had this big teaching. or a discourse. And so when Jesus is done teaching and Matthew's going to move on, he kind of says when Jesus has finished these things. So this is like the last big teaching, last discourse that Jesus has. And so he's kind of moving on because, again, this is coming up to the week of the cross when Jesus will die on the cross and be crucified. And so when he had finished saying all of these things, Jesus told his disciples, you know that the Passover takes place after 2 days. So the Passover, that's from Exodus, when they're slaves, the Hebrews are slaves in Egypt, and there's these different plagues, and God tells them, hey, I'm going to free you to bring you out. And he says, all right, hey, I want you to get a lamb, sacrifice it, and take its blood and put it on your doorposts. And that blood, when the angel comes, it'll see that blood on your doorpost and it will pass over you. No death will come to that household. And we'll talk more about what that looks like next week. But so Jesus says, hey, the Passover is going to come in 2 days, and the Son of Man will be handed over to be crucified. He's being very specific with his prediction. This is the 4th time he's predicting his death. And now he's like saying, hey, in 2 days, this is coming. He's going to be crucified. Verse 3, then the chief priests and the elders of the people assembled in the courtyard of the high priest, who was named Caiaphas. And they conspired against Jesus in a treacherous way and kill him. Not during the festival, they said, so there won't be any rioting among the people. And so now it's, earlier the chief priests, the religious leaders, they're just talking about a way to arrest Jesus. Now it's going to a new level. Right? Hey, let's figure out a way to kill him. And this is like this kind of secret meeting, an extra meeting. They're meeting at the residence, the house of the high priest. And again, you just see like all of their motivation is, we want to make sure that we're good with the people. Let's do it in secret. Not we don't want to cause any rioting. We don't want to get anybody really that upset. And I just think it's interesting that all of these elders, right? All of these priests are meeting there, and not one of them do we see that they're like, hey, do we think this is a good idea? I think it says something in the Old Testament about thou shalt not murder. Right? But none of them seem to care. Right? It just shows you that, man, the people that you hang around with, the culture that you live in, it could really shape you into ways that are not biblical. And so they're scheming. They're going to do this quietly. And then now, and in verses 14 and 16, you see that Judas, one of the disciples, he's going to join in with this scheming, with this plotting, and they're going to pay him. So you have kind of this group of outsiders, if you will, the priests and the elders, and they're like, hey, let's get somebody on the inside. Get him to come in and help us do this. And then we come to verse 6. And it says, while Jesus was in Bethany. So Bethany is this town that's outside of Jerusalem. And John tells us, he kind of lists this out a little bit more in a chronological way. So this is actually 6 days before the crucifixion. This is before Jesus actually has the triumphal entry into Jerusalem itself. And so that might be like, well, why does John have it chronologically in order, and Matthew here doesn't? So Matthew, he knows what the order is. He's not mistaken. But if you notice, right at the beginning of this chapter, right, it's all about these religious leaders plotting and scheming. Right after this story, what do we see? More plotting, scheming, betrayal. And so all of this leading up to Jesus' death, everybody's plotting, everybody's scheming. And what do we find in the middle of this? Matthew is saying, hey, I want to draw your attention to something different. In the middle of all of these things that these people are trying to betray Jesus, there's this beautiful story. That there's something different. So he's inserting this flashback, if you will, to 6 days, four days prior to this, to help show this compare and contrast between all of these religious leaders with Judas, the betrayer, and with what this woman does. And John identifies her as Mary. Mary, the mother, or the sister of Martha, the sister of Lazarus. Lazarus was the one who died, and Jesus told him to come out of the tomb. Lazarus, come out, and raised from the dead. And so that's who that she is. And so here's the first thing that we see in this. First point is this: what did she do? What did Mary do? She poured out. And so again, verse 6. While Jesus was in Bethany at the house of Simon the leper. And this leper, or Simon the leper, he's actually probably most likely been healed from leprosy. You know, it's a very nasty skin disease. And he's been healed by Jesus. Otherwise, he would be in quarantine. Nobody would have even entered his house. And so I think that this is kind of cool because they call him that, Simon the leper. I mean, can you imagine, like, oh, hey, who are you? I'm Simon the leper. Somebody would look at him and be like, hey, just, wait a minute, you don't have leprosy anymore, right? You don't look like you have leprosy. No, I don't. Well, what happened? And then Simon could say, man, do I have a story to tell you? So I met this guy named Jesus, right? That's just a really cool thing. And so they're at this house of Simon the leper, and this is actually just shortly after Lazarus has been raised from the dead. And so they're all there, right? Simon the leper, the guy that used to have leprosy, and then Lazarus is there. I mean, can you imagine this party? Hey Simon, do you remember when you had leprosy? That was gross. But now Jesus has changed you. Hey Lazarus, you remember when you died? What was that like? Are you going to write a book? What was that? You know, like, and they're all remembering. But Jesus brought you back to life. They're remembering all of these things that have happened. And then something kind of changes. So verse 7. A woman, again it's Mary, approached Jesus with an alabaster jar, a very expensive perfume. She poured it out on his head as he was reclining at the table. And so Mary, the sister of Martha, sister of Lazarus, she comes up to Jesus with this big alabaster jar of very expensive perfume, and she pours it out on his head. And it says that this is very expensive perfume. In John, it says that it's pure nard. Right? And nard, this means it most likely came from India. And so this is very costly. This is something that's very hard to replace. You can't just go to Target down the street, go to some merchant down the street and just buy this. This would have been very hard to come by. Very expensive. And the smell, as she's pouring it out, fills the house. And we see how the disciples react to this in verse 8. When the disciples saw it, they were indignant. They react, in this indignance, like they react harshly. They're angry. Why this waste, they asked. Why are you doing this? How could you just use all of this? How could you just waste all of this right now? For them, it's just like nothing fits the occasion. Using this very expensive perfume. This would be like, man, you're wearing a tuxedo to Taco Bell. It's just like, why the waste? It's just Taco Bell. Their reaction is a little bit better understood. In John, it says that this perfume is worth 300 denarii. Basically, that would be a whole year's wage. Think in modern terms. This could be like 30 grand, 40 grand, 50 or 60 grand. Boom, dumped out. Just like that. Think of not just how long it would take to earn that kind of money. Think of how long it would take to save that kind of money. Think about that. If it was just like whatever your yearly wage is, if you work full time, how long would it take you to save that kind of money? And then would you just in an instant be like, boom, there it goes, all gone. But that's exactly what happened. She just pours it out. There's a good chance that this is actually like a family heirloom that's been passed down. And this is more than just perfume. This is like a savings account. If times get really thin, if times get really hard, man, we have this. Oh, there's famine, there's war. We could turn to this perfume, this nard, and go and sell it and help us to make it through. This thing is like financial security. Not just for Mary, but for this whole house. And then what does she do with this extremely valuable possession? She pours it out. Pours it out on his head, pours it out on his feet. And this alabaster jar that she has, I mean, just again to help you think through this, I mean, it would have been this jar and it would have had this really skinny neck. And because it's so expensive, they would have sealed it in such a way to make sure that it's very preserved. That none of it's going to leak out, that none of it's going to be compromised. And so the only way that for you to open it would actually be to break that very skinny neck at the top. And so it's not like she's just kind of like, boop, pop, pop, pop. Drops a little bit. I mean, even in Mark, it says that she broke it and pours it all out. So everything's coming out. All of the expensive perfume, all of the year's wage, all of these thousands of dollars, all of the financial security is all being put on Jesus. 100% of it is being poured out on him. She uses the whole thing. Now, I just want you to contrast this with what Mary's doing with Judas. And what he's doing in verses 14 through 16 is he goes to the chief priest to ask him, hey, what would you give me? Right? So Mary is pouring out on Jesus. Judas is trying to profit off of Jesus. Right? She's giving everything to Jesus. Where Judas is like, what can I get out of Jesus? So she pours out this expensive perfume, and in this, what she's saying that the most valuable thing that I have, the most valuable thing that I possess, I give to you, Jesus. The security, the hope that I have in financial times and tough times, the thing that would calm my fears when things are going really hard, I give to you, Jesus. Because Jesus, my security is no longer in this, it's in you. Jesus, no longer do I trust in just my financial success and what I have, but Jesus, I trust in you. My hope is in you. Jesus, you're more important to me than this. You're more valuable than this. And so the question is what is your alabaster flask? What is that thing for you? That maybe you put so much security in, so much of your life, so much of your hope in that isn't Jesus. Something that is so valuable, precious to you. Maybe it could be your bank account. Maybe it could be your job. Maybe it could be your skills. And you think, well, at least I have that. I always can have that. Maybe it's a relationship you have. Maybe it's kids. Maybe it's comfort. What is your alabaster flask? What is something that you maybe need to surrender to Jesus to worship him? Because right now you can't ever imagine giving that to Jesus. You've been withholding it. Maybe it's money. Maybe it's time. Or just security, comfort. Kids, let me ask you guys a question. What is one thing, just think kids, what is one thing, one way that you could just worship Jesus this upcoming week? Or even today? What's one thing that you could give to Jesus or worship in him? Because in this moment, what can Mary only see? Jesus. Right? She's not, but what could the disciples only see? The perfume. What a waste. Because they could only see the perfume where all she could see is Christ. And so for her, it's, man, this is not a waste. This is worship. Jesus is worth more. Even Jesus says, this is a beautiful thing. Do you see Jesus that way? Do you see Jesus as just like, Jesus, you're worth so much to me. I mean, even the word worship, worth-ship. Do you see Jesus as something that is so valuable, someone that is extremely valuable to you, that he is most precious to you? Not that do you know that's how you should see him, but do you see him that way? I mean, do you see Jesus that you might look, do you see Jesus that way, that it's moved you to do something that actually looks a little ridiculous to the other people around you, right? They're all indignant. Like, how could you? It doesn't make sense to them. Why is Jesus ever that precious to you, or precious to just the people of God that we just look a little weird? Man, you're going to do that? That's crazy. Something that we would give to him that's so lavish and bold. But Mary, she doesn't just pour out perfume in what she's doing. She pours out herself. So John tells us that as she's doing this, she lets down her hair and she pours it on Jesus' head and she pours it on Jesus' feet, and then that she wipes his feet with her hair. In 1 Corinthians 11, it says that a woman's hair is her glory. And so what she's doing in this, she's saying, Jesus, I'm going to let my hair down. Something that she would only do in the privacy of her own home. Right at that time, they would really bound their hair up, and that's the only place that they would do it, at home, and if they were married, in front of their husband, in front of their relatives, where they're very comfortable. And so she's saying, Jesus, I feel at home in you, Jesus. My identity is not in these things. It's not in my glory. I lay I lay my glory at your feet. I'm not just giving you everything that I have. I'm giving you everything that I am. Jesus, it belongs to you. She's giving it all to him, showing her confidence, showing her identity in him, that her very self belongs to him, is found in him. Have you experienced Jesus this way? That you could give him things, but that you give him yourself. That he is where you belong. That he is where your identity, your glory, everything is found. You lay not just your stuff, but yourself at his feet. Not because you have to, right? Nobody's telling Mary to do this. Nobody made Mary do this. But because she wants to. However, how you measure the worth of Jesus will determine the measure of your worship. However you measure the worth of Jesus will determine the measure of your worship to him. And so we see what she did, and that she poured out her perfume, she poured out herself, she bowed down to worship him. But why did she do it? So that's the second point, is why did she do it? She perceived. So the best oil was given to kings, was given to priests when they were being anointed, when they were being kind of brought into that. And so she's saying, she recognizes Jesus as her authority, as her king. And Jesus had kept telling the disciples, over and over again, man, we're heading to Jerusalem, and I'm going to die. We're heading there, and I'm going to die. I'm going to be handed over. I lay my life down. All of these things. And it just, for the disciples, it just doesn't really make sense. It's really tough for them to connect a few of the dots here. But Mary believed Jesus. Look at what he says. They say, hey, you could have, why this waste? This could have been sold for a great deal and given to the poor. And Jesus says, verse 10, aware of this, Jesus said to them, why are you bothering this woman? She's done a noble, beautiful thing for me. You always have the poor with you, but you do not always have me. Jesus isn't saying hey, I don't care anything about the poor. He's made that very clear. But he's just saying, you always have that. But Jesus, knowing, man, his death is coming. And he's like, hey, this is a different opportunity that you have. And then verse 12, he says, by pouring perfume, this perfume on my body, she has prepared me for my burial. Right? The other disciples don't really seem to get it, but she listened to Jesus and believed him. She believed him. She doesn't fully understand everything that's going to happen and why Jesus is dying and what's going to happen in the resurrection. She doesn't understand. But she's believing what Jesus said, that, man, you're going to die. And then this shows us the focus that Matthew's having on the value of the death of Jesus. Not that just Jesus died for us, but that he died instead of us. It's more valuable than we can imagine. Jesus dying. So Mary is giving this perfume. She recognizes that Jesus is going to die, and maybe this can just take the sting out of death itself. I mean, if you had a friend that helped you, let's say that you're in this really tough phase of life, and I mean, you're just broke, you have nothing, and one of your friends said, hey, you could come live with me for a while, I'll buy you food, I'll take care of you until you can kind of get back on your feet. Now later on, would you be thinking, man, I'm going to give that friend maybe some show of gratitude and generosity, and I'll take him out for a nice dinner? Right? Yeah. I think a lot of us would do that. Hopefully. Right? It's like, thanks, friend, you really helped me in a tough spot. We'd want to be generous back. Now let's say that you were trapped in a burning building and your friend ran into the fire. Wouldn't be Alex. He's afraid of fire. Seriously, but not a building, but they run into the burning building and they get you out of the fire and pull you out. Right? I mean, your probably sense of gratitude towards that friend is even bigger. Man, you didn't just help me in a tough spot. You saved my life. But would you, whether a friend helped you out in a really tough situation of life, or they even saved your life, would you bow down to them? No. Right? You wouldn't worship them. You would be thankful for them. You'd be generous to them. You'd give them something, but you wouldn't bow down to them. Why? Because they're still not worthy of your worship. Right? That's still not who they are. Right? She doesn't just give Jesus a nice gift. She bows down to him. She worships him. Because she doesn't think that Jesus is just a nice guy who's helped her in some tough spots. She believes Jesus is God. She believes Jesus has power over life and death itself. Her brother was stuck in a tomb for multiple days. And just by the power of Jesus' word, Lazarus come out. She sees him come out. She believes that, man, this is God. She has this proper view of Jesus that she could see him. She perceives him correctly. And so that's why she'll give her all of her things, all of her stuff to him. How do you measure the worth of Jesus? How do you? Right? Contrast this with the disciples. They're indignant. They're fine selling the jar of perfume to give to the poor, but they're not fine giving it to Jesus. Right? That at this point they don't perceive fully who Jesus is. That's why they call it a waste. Because whenever you don't perceive Jesus correctly, you'll always be calculated in what you give him. You'll always be calculated in what you give Jesus if you don't perceive him correctly. Right? For them, this is like giving an expensive steak, an expensive ribeye to a dog. I mean, think, if you went to top-notch steak place, you're like, hey, I'm going to buy this, I'm going to take this home, I'm going to grill it, man, it's this, $15, $20 a pound steak. Are you being like, hey, yeah, now I'm just going to feed it to the dog? Heck no, I'm eating that thing. Right? I'm not giving any of it to the dog. Definitely not the cat. Right? There is no cat. Right? But you're not, right? The only way that you're giving some of that to your dog is because if it's the scraps. You're fine giving the scraps to a dog. You're fine maybe giving the dog a bite of it if you're kind of super full, or you're like, man, the steak wasn't as good as I thought. Why? Because it's a dog. And so you calculate, you proportion what you'll give a dog. If you have an incorrect view of Jesus, you will always be calculated in what you give him. I'll give you this, but I won't give you that. You'll approach Jesus with a sense of proportion. Jesus, this belongs to me. It doesn't belong to you. If the moment Jesus doesn't give you something that you want, your devotion draws back. Now you think that you're drawing your devotion back away from Jesus because of your circumstances. Let me tell you, If you're really facing really tough times and your devotion of Jesus goes down, that's not because of your circumstances. It's because of how you view God. It's how you view Him. Because the moment that He gives you the stuff that you want, back in you go. Because you view Jesus as like, man, you're mainly here to make me happy. Judas. It doesn't exactly tell us why he betrayed Jesus. But what do we notice Judas doing? He's there with Jesus. And it tells us in other Gospels that he was the treasurer and that he was secretly taking money for himself. Jesus is saying, I'm going to die, I'm going to die. And maybe Judas is thinking, he is, and there goes my money-making system. If he's gone, I have no way to make any money. And what does he do? He goes and makes money off of Jesus, doing what he's been doing the whole time. I mean, think, Judas had invested 3 years of his life. 3 years of his life with Jesus. He had been with this guy. And then in the end, what is Jesus worth to him? He doesn't even negotiate the price. We'll give you 30 pieces of silver. Sounds good. Calculated worship of Jesus because of how he saw Jesus, how he perceived Jesus to be. How you measure the worth of Jesus will determine the measure of your worship. Is your worship calculated? What you give Jesus, what you surrender to Jesus, shows what you think of him, who he really is. Think of the other side. What Jesus gave for you shows you what he really thinks about you, right? Yeah. Gave you everything. So how do you see Jesus? Is he just like a good friend? Someone there that can be for you in trouble? I'll give you some of my stuff, but not so much of all that I am. Do you see Jesus like a hobby that he's just kind of there when it's convenient? Or do you see him do you see him as your Savior? Do you see him not just as God, but your God? How big do you think Jesus really is? I mean, he made the earth, he made the moon, he made the sun, he made the solar system, he made the universe just by the breath of his word. I mean, there's stars far bigger than our sun. The biggest known sun, get this, is 93 million miles across. The Milky Way, our galaxy, if you're traveling at 186,000 miles a second for 53,000 years, that's how big our galaxy is. And in Hebrews it says, and he sustains all of these things by the power of his word. All things are made by him and for him. How do you approach a God like that? He's so big. And not only did he just breathe these things and sustain all these things, he knows the number of hairs on your head. I mean, do you approach him in this calculated way? God will take you away what you say about forgiveness and what you say about that. I like that. Give me some more of that. Hey, but when it comes to like my money or my gender or sexuality or any of these things, I don't like that. Keep your nose out of that. You don't have the right to tell me those things. I mean, when we sing to God, when we sing and just praise his name on Sunday, is it just like, man, are we just singing because there's words on the screen? Or are we singing these things because they're true of our God? Yeah. He's so good. He's so amazing. How do you see Jesus? How you measure the worth of Jesus will determine the measure of your worship. Does his worth match your worship? Because Mary shows us what she perceived Jesus to be. Why did she do what she did? She shows us how to respond, but also she shows us how she was able to do it. So that's the last thing. How was she able to do it? How was she able to see Jesus like that? To see him for his worth? Because of her position. A couple of commentaries pointed this out to me. Up until this point, where do we always find Mary? What do we find Mary? In Luke 10, while they were traveling, Jesus entered a village, and a woman named Martha welcomed Jesus into her home. She had a sister named Mary, who also sat at the Lord's feet and was listening to what he said. But Martha was distracted by her many tasks, and she came up and asked, Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to serve alone? So tell her to give me a hand. The Lord answered, Martha, Martha, you're worried and upset about many things, but one thing is necessary. Mary has made the right choice by sitting at my feet, and it will not be taken away from her. So here in Luke, she's sitting at the feet of Jesus, listening, learning from Jesus. In John 11, her brother Lazarus is dead, and Lazarus is dead, and Jesus shows up. And as soon as she comes to Jesus, she throws herself onto Jesus' feet, weeping and grieving and crying. And here in Matthew, she's at Jesus' feet, pouring out. And so, where do we always see Mary? At the feet of Jesus. Whether she's learning, listening, whether she's grieving, whether she's worshiping, she's there at the feet of Jesus. That's her position. She didn't just suddenly come to think that Jesus was really awesome and really worthy, and just offer the perfume and offer him all of herself. The more and more that she was at the feet of Jesus, whatever situation it was, she saw him more for who he really is. One thing, Jesus said, is necessary, and that will not be taken away from her. She's seen who Christ is. And so our application today, what we're supposed to do isn't just like, go give everything up. Just go give everything to Jesus. That's not just the application. It's go get at his feet. How do we see Jesus for who he is? How do we actually better measure his worth? Whatever you're going through, get at the feet of Jesus. I mean, we could easily forget how to sit at his feet, how to see him. We could forget to just take time to just look at Christ, to hear him through his word, to speak to him in prayer. And I know some of you are going to be thinking like, yep. I need to begin in the Bible. What is the Bible? Right? The Bible isn't mainly telling you, hey, here's all the things you need to do. No, what is the Bible? The Bible is God's word revealing himself to you. You want to see God? Here you go. You want to see what God's like? Bam! God is revealing himself, not first about what you've given to God, but about what he's given to you. Second, as we sit at that position, at the feet of Jesus, looking at him, right? The same thing that happened to Mary will be the same thing that happened to us. We'll be changed. We'll be transformed. In 2 Corinthians 3:18 it says, we who look, who contemplate, who behold Jesus, the Lord's glory, are being transformed into the same image, the image of Christ. As we behold Jesus, we'll become more like him. As we behold Jesus, we'll be changed. As we behold Jesus, we'll see him more and more clearly for what he is worth. His goodness, his faithfulness, his truth, his glory. The more and more we'll to see how crazy and beautiful the gospel is. And so our application is not just first go give Jesus everything, but first look at what he gave. God so loved the world that he gave his one and only son. God so loved the world that he gave his best. In this, Jesus is the true and better alabaster flask. He's the true gift. He's the true thing that has been poured out for us. I mean, even just later in this chapter, Jesus says, this is my blood which has been poured out for you, poured out for the many for the forgiveness of sin. He's been poured out for you. He's been poured out for me, so that we might know Christ, so that we might see his worth. Let's pray. Heavenly Father God, Lord, we thank you that you are worthy, or that you are so good. Lord, I pray today that you just help us all to see your glory, to see your goodness, to see your worth. But Lord, maybe there is something that we just need to, maybe we just need to take some time today, this week, and Lord, help us to just build this rhythm, this habit in our life of just looking at who you are, God, of how good you are. Lord, because your worth is way more than any of us think. And so, Lord, give us the strength, Lord, to just see you more clearly, Lord, to see just how good and worth you are. Lord, I pray, Lord, if there's something that we are maybe just holding back, Lord, that if we're just looking to something for our identity, for our life, Lord, help us to just give that to you, to surrender that to you, Lord, and so that not just internally, Lord, that we worship you, but our lives are poured out for you. Our lives are given to you, Lord, because you've given us everything. I ask all this in your name. Amen.